You are now live on YouTube. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just wait until it just strikes 7 o'clock. Right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's Growth and Development Scrutiny Board of Rushcliffborough Council. You've probably got used to the fact now, but we are carrying out this meeting virtually on Zoom in line with the COVID regulations and guidelines. And we have members of the committee and officers present who are either maybe some in an office and some working from home. Obviously, we have guests who are may well be watching us in on the YouTube link. So we are live on the YouTube link. For the benefit of those who are watching in, I am Neil Clark. I'm the chairman of the scrutiny group. Councillor Verdi is vice chairman, and we also have present Councillor Bailey, Councillor Howitt, Councillor Phillips, Councillor John Stockwood, Councillor Way, and Councillor Maureen Stockwood. Also, we have present officers. We have Leanne Ashmore, who is the executive manager responsible for communities, and we have the service manager for communities, Andrew Pegram, and he is supported by Catherine Evans, Sarah Baker, and we have two of our Democratic Services officers with us as well. So that is the makeup of the committee. Before we start the meeting proper, however, just need to start on a slightly sad note, but I would like us to pay tribute to Dave Mitchell, who sadly passed away 10 days or so ago, losing fight to many health issues which he had, and he was just on the point of retirement. He was the executive manager for communities, and he was the main lead officer for this particular scrutiny group. And I can say without any doubt at all that, well, first of all, he was very friendly and a very nice chap, but he was extremely well respected and well thought of by not just his own colleagues in the council, but also by outside organisations. I've had several parish clerks, make mention of how they used to enjoy dealing with him. So he was, I've known him practically the entire time he's been with the council, which is 30 odd years. And so he has contributed greatly to the workings of the council. He was very dedicated, very loyal to the council, and he's an asset that we shall all very sadly miss. So in tribute to Dave, perhaps could we please just have a minute's silence just to think about Dave and pay tribute to him. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And I should have said as well, our thoughts also obviously go out to his family, who will be going through an extremely tough and difficult time at the moment. I'm sure that we'll be saying a lot more about Dave at the next full council meeting. But thank you for that tribute. So let's return to the agenda proper. And to item 1, apologies for absence, please.
We have apologies from Councillor Cotty. We have Councillor Maureen Stockwood as a substitute, and we've had a late apology from Councillor Nazim Begum. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Item 2, declarations of interest. Do we have any pecuniary interests that anybody wishes to declare? I'll take silence as no. And anybody have any private interest or personal interests that you wish to declare? Nope. Okay, thank you for that. Item 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 20th of January. May we approve those as a true and correct record? Perhaps I can take silence as in favour. If anybody has any problems or issues to raise, please speak now. Otherwise, I will assume that everybody is approving the minutes. So I will take those as approved. Thank you very much indeed. So we now turn to the substantive item on the agenda. We were going to have 2 items on the agenda, but one of them has been postponed. And so we have just the one item relating to conservation areas, which starts on page 7. This was requested in one of the scrutiny matrices, and this is why it has come to this scrutiny group. And I think it may well be that we won't come to a final conclusion this evening, and I think it may well need further questions and answers to come back at a future meeting. But certainly we can set the scene and pose some of the questions. I have actually, I did invite Councillor Roger Upton, who is the Cabinet Portfolio member, to join us and to contribute to the debate, because I thought it would be useful, as conservation areas comes within his portfolio, if he was to contribute. I understand and believe that he's having connection problems. Tracy, could you just confirm, or Laura, has he managed to join, or has he still got connection problems?
I think Laura is still talking to him, so we are trying to get him in.
I've just changed the settings on Zoom, so I'm hoping he'll be able to join again. I think because he left, he can't come back in. So I've just changed the settings, and I'm hoping that he'll be with us soon.
Right. Okay. Fine. Well, if he suddenly appears, that would be welcome, because I say, I thought that it would be useful for him to have a contribution as the Cabinet Portfolio as well. So we have a fairly short report, and I believe that to start things off, we have a presentation. Am I correct, Mr. Pegram?
That's correct, Chairman. Yes.
So am I correct, Leanne? Are you wishing to sort of introduce anything, or are we going straight into the presentation?
Thank you, Chair. We're going to go straight into the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so Mr. Pegram, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. The presentation effectively builds on the information already in the report and provides additional information. That presentation will be available to the committee or to the group after the meeting. Sarah Baker, our Conservation Officer, is with us this evening. We're going to do a bit of a double act, so I'll share the presentation and Sarah will do the first part, and then I'll pick up part way through. So bear with me just 1 second while I bring up the presentation for you. So hopefully that should be visible to you now.
Yep, sure.
Over to you, Sarah, for the first part then.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak this evening. I am the Conservation Officer for Rushcliffborough Council, and I have been since September 2019, although due to the pandemic, I haven't had the opportunity to meet as many of you as I would like. This is a very nice opportunity this evening. So to begin this evening, I thought that what I would do is try and walk you through a bit of the conservation areas for Rushcliffe and also the policy and legislation surrounding these. So as we begin here with conservation areas, and what is a conservation area and why are they designated? Now, conservation areas are irreplaceable heritage assets. They're made up of a number of components forming a part of the historic environment. A common phrase that you may see, paragraph. Hopefully the lights have gone out here. Excuse me one moment while I get them back on for the camera. It's very unhelpful. Apologies, that was unfortunate timing.
Just so you know, Sarah, if the lights go out again, actually we can see you surprisingly.
Oh, good.
Well anyway, actually, so
Good.
perhaps if they go out again, persevere, and if we can't see you, we'll let you know.
Good, thank you. So yes, these assets are an irreplaceable resource and they should be conserved in a manner appropriate to their significance, so they can be enjoyed for their contribution to the quality of life of the existing and future generations. They are covered by legislation, national and local policies. These are in place for the conservation and enhancement of the historic environment. Conservation areas are places of special interest where it is considered especially important to preserve the character and appearance of the area. Extra planning controls are in place to help the council manage change to preserve or enhance the special interests of the conservation area. This means that we're not looking to stop development, but to carefully guide and control anything that comes through as a development proposal so that the special interest is preserved or enhanced. After all, the charm of many of our conservation areas developed over time, and it doesn't belong to one phase of development. And so we're hoping to take things forward in a positive fashion for the future. We have 30 conservation areas within Rushcliffe, and preparatory work has been undertaken for the creation of a new conservation area in Cropwell Bishop. This has to go out for a consultation exercise with the public, but this has been delayed due to the coronavirus pandemic. And following this, it can be formally designated. The special interest of the conservation area may come from the quality of its buildings, its landscape setting, the quality of open spaces, boundary materials, the layout of streets and buildings, evidence of past functions, and other distinctive characteristics. We'll touch on these as we go through the presentation. So the second part here is about legislation and policy, and you can progress the slide, please, Andrew. Right. So under statutory duties, we have Section 72 of the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act 1990. This is the principal legislation which applies to conservation areas, and it provides specific protection for buildings and areas of special architectural or historic interest. In addition to this legislation, the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas regulations contain procedural provisions relating to applications affecting listed buildings and conservation areas. This act relates in several ways to conservation areas, including Section 69, which we won't be discussing in depth this evening, but relates to the designation of conservation areas and how the local planning authority can undertake from time to time determination of new conservation areas. But also, and most importantly, the focus of this evening is Section 72, which relates to the general duties of planning authorities. When considering planning applications for development within a conservation area, Section 72 of the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act imposes a statutory duty on local planning authorities to pay special attention to the desirability of preserving or enhancing the character or appearance of the area. So to go down a few questions, what must we have when we are considering a planning application with proposals for development in a conservation area? We must have special attention. What is desirable, that is to preserve or enhance the conservation area. What should be preserved or enhanced, the character and/or appearance of the area, and in all cases, the duty is for the local authority to consider the desirability of proposals. Statutory duty under Section 72 must be seen to be given great weight in any decision taken. Great weight must be given to Section 72, although the statutory duties can be outweighed by material planning benefits, and these need to be explicitly shown to be of great weight. It needs to be explicitly shown that great weight has been given to the Act in the balancing process. Now, a common question surrounding development relates to harm, and Andrew is going to go into further detail about this during his half of the presentation. But you can keep in your mind that there are 3 potential outcomes in terms of harm when considering an application. Firstly, no harm. Secondly, less than substantial harm. And then third, significant harm or total loss. Now, determination of the appropriate level is carried out during evaluation of an application by an officer, and this often relies on their training, expertise, and experience. It is informed by policy and by consideration of relevant documentation, including conservation area townscape appraisals as a simple example. We'll be touching on these shortly. Legal precedent regarding the wording of these sections of the Act means that if a proposal causes any harm, then it cannot be said to preserve or enhance the conservation area, and the proposals would automatically fall into conflict with these statutory duties. Next slide, please, Andrew. Now, at the national level, we have relevant policies from the National Planning Policy Framework. And this is covered under Chapter 16, Conserving and Enhancing the Historic Environment, and specifically Policy 193, which considers potential impacts. This is what is listed on the slide. When considering the impact of proposed development on the significance of a designated heritage asset, great weight should be given to the asset's conservation. And the more important the asset, the greater the weight should be. This is irrespective of whether any potential harm amounts to substantial harm, total loss, or less than substantial harm to its significance. Next slide, please, Andrew. We also have local policies that are in place within Rushcliffe's local plans, part 1 and 2. And these also apply during the consideration of any planning application for development in a conservation area. The above paragraph and heading refers to Local Plan Part 1, Core Strategy Policy 11, about the historic environment, and this comes from paragraph 1. Proposals and initiatives will be supported where the historic environment and heritage assets and their settings are conserved and/or enhanced in line with their interest and significance. Planning decisions will have regard to the contribution heritage assets can make to the delivery of wider social, cultural, economic, and environmental objectives. And officers take this into consideration whilst making a determination. Next slide, please. In Local Plan Part 2, we have Policy 28 about the historic environment, which is conserving and enhancing heritage assets. Specifically, paragraph 2 is shown here, points A to C, and it sets out where proposals affecting a heritage asset and/or its setting will be considered against the following criteria: the significance of the asset, whether the proposals would be sympathetic to the character and appearance of the asset, and any feature of special historic, architectural, artistic, or archaeological interest that it possesses, whether the proposals would conserve or enhance the character and appearance of the heritage asset by virtue of siting, scale, building form, massing, height, materials, and quality of detail. Now we'll move on to the final bit of my aspect of the presentation. So we're going to consider conservation area documents that Rushcliffe has set out for conservation areas within Rushcliffe. Andrew, you can advance the first slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are 30 conservation areas within Rushcliffe, and hopefully one further one to come soon. For each conservation area, there is a map showing the extent of the conservation area, and that is what's on screen at the moment. This is the area which is the subject of the designation of the conservation area, and it will normally be identified as a boundary line on a plan. So for example, here we have Ruddington's conservation area boundary. And in the conservation area document, this is described as a boundary that has been reviewed to ensure it follows a logical and definable route. Consultation revealed how much the sylvan character of Kirk Lane in Ruddington and Loughborough Road, also in Ruddington, was valued by the village. This combined with a range of positive buildings to result in their inclusion within the conservation area. Next slide, please, Andrew. We also produce a conservation area appraisal and management plan for any conservation area. And here we have one for Ruddington. The appraisal highlights key characteristics that give the conservation area its special interest. I should underline again that all of these documents are publicly available on Rushcliffe's website under the Conservation Areas in Rushcliffe section. These are the result of a determination process to understand features and requirements that make an area special, and one exists for every one of our conservation areas. The appraisals are intended to guide anyone considering development within the conservation area so that proposed changes are sensitive to the character and the appearance of the conservation area. It looks into the settlement's history, archaeology, and development over time, and in some cases, this can go back as far as prehistory and certainly continues through into modern times. It looks at industry, it considers local building materials and local details that are unique to each conservation area, and it reflects on the special character of the conservation areas in terms of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. When you look at somewhere like Ruddington, they have identified a dense village centre with many rows of small terraces, and they feel as though the village has a distinct urban feel to the centre. This has been recognised now within the appraisal. Many buildings provide a strong link to the industrial past of the village, and the green in Ruddington provides a direct contrast to the density of the village. So these are just a few examples of what the key characteristics are spelled out as. On to the next slide, please, Andrew. Finally, we have Townscape Appraisals. Again, one of these is produced for each of our conservation areas. I really enjoy working with these because they incorporate all of the small details that have been considered during the consideration of the special interest of a conservation area. So here we have the boundary of the conservation area, and often in pink, striped red, we have the listed buildings. And then in pink, we have key unlisted buildings or positive buildings within the conservation area. These are unlisted buildings or non-designated heritage assets that play an important part within the special architectural and historic interest of an area. And you can see quite quickly that there are often a large number of these within each conservation area. They also identify in green large positive open spaces that are quite key to the feel and character of each of these conservation areas. These positive open spaces and important views into or out of the conservation area are identified on the plan. And other details such as boundary treatments like walls and hedgerows and significant trees are also included if these are considered to be an important part of the special character of the area. So that has briefly touched on what conservation areas are within Rushcliffe and some of the documentation that we've produced. And now I'll hand over to Andrew.
Thank you, Sarah. So Sarah has set the background or the scene for the rest of the presentation. And the next section deals with effectively what the implications of having the conservation areas are on development and other aspects of planning. I'm going to cover three main aspects here. One is what we refer to as permitted development. The other is how the interplay between conservation area designation and consideration of planning applications work. And then finally, a bit about trees within conservation areas. One final slide will bring up details of other related issues to heritage assets, basically. So if we start with permitted development, we use the term permitted development quite liberally, but effectively what permitted development is its development which has been granted planning permission by virtue of the provisions of the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development Order 2015. That covers a whole range of different developments. Typically, and probably most well known, is extensions to residential properties, but it does also cover issues for commercial development, work by statutory undertakers, telecommunications development, etc. Within the GPDO, conservation areas are referred to as Article 2.3 land, and the excuse me, this imposes certain conditions and limitations on development within conservation areas. So the permitted development rights themselves are subject to limitations and conditions which apply even outside the conservation areas. But within conservation areas, and I'll illustrate that in a moment, those restrictions are even tighter. So if we just run through the main examples. So on a residential property, first bullet point, you can extend any property in the borough with an extension either up to 4 metres on a detached house or up to 3 metres in any other case. There's an extended version of that which relies on a prior approval process. So between 4 and 8 metres on a detached property and 3 and 6 metres on any other dwelling, there's a prior approval process. That does not apply in conservation areas. So the only limit in conservation areas, people can still extend with a rear extension up to 4 or 3 metres, and anything above that then requires planning permission. If you wanted to clad the exterior of your dwelling house or any part of it, that would require planning permission in a conservation area. Elsewhere, that could be done potentially without permission. The enlargement of a dwelling house beyond the wall forming a side elevation. So clearly, again, outside of a conservation area, you can build an extension to the side, subject to meeting the other criteria, up to half the width of the dwelling house, but that does not apply in a conservation area. Again, where any part of the enlargement beyond the rear wall of a dwelling house would have more than a single story, elsewhere that might be permitted, but not in a conservation area, and planning permission would be required. The enlargement of a dwelling house consisting of an enlargement to its roof. So this would be either a hip to gable or a dormer window. In normal circumstances, that can be done, except where the dormer window is on the front elevation. But again, it is precluded within the conservation area. And finally, on this slide, where any part of a building, enclosure, pool or container would be located effectively to the side of the dwelling, that also would require planning permission in a conservation area. Next slide. So the installation of a chimney, flue or soil pipe on a wall or roof which fronts a highway in a conservation area is not permitted development, and planning permission would be required. Similarly, the installation of an antenna on a wall or roof slope which faces onto or would be visible from a highway, or the building exceeds 15 metres in height. So again, those are additional restrictions that apply within conservation areas. Some commercial development, certain changes of use. So there are permitted development rights for change of use from retail to residential or dwelling house. And again, that is a use which is not permitted within a conservation area. Also, there are limitations on extensions and modifications to shops, office buildings, industrial and warehouse buildings, schools, colleges, universities or hospitals where they are located in a conservation area. An unusual one that I stumbled across in the GPDO here is toll road facilities, which in a conservation area need to be subject to a prior approval process. But I don't think we've got any toll roads in our conservation areas in Rushcliffe, so not one to worry about perhaps. Moving on, so the installation of PV or solar thermal equipment on non-domestic premises on a roof slope which fronts a highway would require permission in a conservation area. Strangely enough, that doesn't apply on residential properties, so you could potentially put solar panels on the front elevation of a roof. Installation of standalone solar equipment between the building and the boundary with the highway, again, is not permitted development in a conservation area. And then finally, there are limitations that apply to certain operations by statutory undertakers or in relations to telecommunications development. So all of those examples in conservation areas would have to come to us as a specific planning application. Moving on to planning applications themselves and the implications for determination of applications. But firstly, the legislation imposes additional requirements on us when we publicise applications. So in certain circumstances, we can publicise or notify neighbours either by the service of letters on them or by displaying a notice in the area. In a conservation area, the Conservation Area Act, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act requires that we display a notice in every case advertising the development, and we also have to place a notice in a local newspaper circulating in the locality, and for us that is the Nottingham Post. Hopefully that's not seen as an advertisement for the paper. Just to reinforce and revisit, Sarah's already explained it, but section 72 of the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act does impose a statutory duty on us when considering applications to give great weight to the desirability for preserving or enhancing the character and appearance of the area. So that just to re-emphasise what Sarah said to you earlier. In terms of some snippets from the National Planning Policy Framework, paragraph 193 says that when considering the impact of a proposed development on the significance of a designated heritage asset, great weight should be given to the asset's conservation. And that duty and that requirement applies to your officers when we are considering an application and formulating a recommendation. It also applies to the committee when they are considering a planning application as the decision makers. The NPPF also provides in the glossary a definition of significance. And again, I won't dwell on that because Sarah has already explained in terms of significance and what that means. So as Sarah indicated, I will cover the issues of harm. There are 3 levels of harm. And I must admit, when I was reading through this earlier again, I did think that there's a potential conflict with the advice I give to members of the planning committee, because I often say that all development has some impact. However, in the context of a conservation area, that impact is not necessarily harmful. So the lowest level of harm, or where there is no harm actually, is no harm, and the development would be considered to preserve the character and appearance of the conservation area. The next level, or the top level of harm, is substantial harm, and the advice in the NPPF is that we should refuse consent unless it can be demonstrated that the substantial harm or total loss is necessary to achieve substantial public benefits that outweigh that harm. So effectively, taken with the statutory duty, that does place a presumption in favour of refusal unless it can be demonstrated that those public benefits outweigh the harm. I've deliberately left less than substantial harm to last, because effectively this obviously sits between no harm and substantial harm and can be quite a broad spectrum. So you can end up with less than substantial harm, but at the lower end of the scale, or you can have less than substantial harm that sits just below that higher level of substantial harm. And again, in those instances, we should weigh against the harm the public benefits of the proposal, where appropriate, securing the optimum viable use for the site or asset. So what constitutes harm? There's actually no statutory definition of what harm is. Whether harm exists and the degree of harm is a matter of judgment. So that's again, a matter of judgment for your officers and for the planning committee as a decision maker when they are considering planning applications. Examples of harm, and this is not intended to be exhaustive, but can include harm may arise from works to the asset or from development within its setting, which may be unsympathetic or cause harm to that setting by perhaps obscuring an important view of the building. Loss of historic fabric, excuse me, loss of historic fabric. So obviously if someone is seeking to demolish part of a listed building or a building in its entirety or a listed structure, that would be loss of historic fabric, and that would normally constitute substantial harm. Impact on important views into or out of conservation areas. In those townscape appraisals that Sarah showed in her part of the presentation, there are often views identified, and clearly we have to consider the impact of any development on those views and whether they would cause harm to the character of the conservation area. Loss of trees, which contribute to the character of the area. So clearly, again, Sarah referred to the sylvan character of Loughborough Road, and clearly if those trees were lost or a significant number were lost, that could harm the character of that part of the conservation area. Loss of features identified as important to the character and appearance of the conservation area. So again, Sarah referred to walls, railings, hedges, all of which may make a significant or contribution to the character and appearance of the area, and therefore their loss would potentially cause harm. And the final one on there is unsympathetic development. So clearly, again, matter of judgment, but new buildings or development in the conservation area which may be considered to be unsympathetic to the character and the appearance of that area. So we've talked about harm and we've talked about weighing the public benefits against that harm, but what are public benefits? So again, the NPPG helps us out here a little bit, but public benefits may follow from many developments and could be anything that delivers economic, social, or environmental objectives. And those three objectives are, if you like, the strand that runs through sustainable development as well, which is identified in paragraph 11 of the NPPF. So the public benefits should flow from the proposed development. They should be of a nature or scale to benefit the public at large and not just private benefit. So again, rarely in planning is a personal circumstance a material planning consideration, but if an argument was made, for instance, that an extension was required because of an individual's particular circumstances, that would not amount to a public benefit. Benefits are not necessarily always visible or accessible. So again, as Sarah highlighted, it's important that we maintain, preserve and enhance our heritage assets. And clearly if a development assists in maintaining or putting into a viable use a heritage asset, that can be seen as a public benefit. Examples of heritage benefits may include sustaining or enhancing the significance of a heritage asset and contributing to its setting, reducing or removing risk to a heritage asset, and the final one is securing an optimum viable use for a heritage asset. So clearly, if a building, and I can think of one in Bingham, which is probably known to many members, if a building is falling into disrepair and is a listed building, if a optimum viable use can be found for that building, and some of the alterations to facilitate that use could be seen as harmful, the fact that that building is being preserved or protected from falling into further disrepair could actually be seen as outweighing any harm that exists. Examples of other benefits may include creation of employment, making other forms of contribution to the economy, so that's your economic benefits, contributing to the supply of housing or providing accessible services, that's your social benefits that come from one of the three strands, or mitigating or adapting, typo here, adapting to climate change or providing biodiversity net gain. So that would be an example of the environmental benefits. Just to take you through a bit of a case study, or one that we've dealt with. This was an application for demolition of a property in Colston Bassett and the replacement with a new dwelling. So here you have effectively two aspects to considering impact on the character and appearance of the conservation area. This building would require planning permission for relevant demolition in a conservation area. The consideration of that application would turn on the contribution that that building makes to the area. So in this instance, you can see it's a 1960s, 70s bungalow. This one was not considered to make a particular contribution to the character and appearance of the conservation area. And the ruling or the view taken at that time was that the loss of that building would cause no harm to the conservation area and therefore would preserve the character and appearance of the area. This is the replacement building that went on the site, a modern contemporary design. But again, in this instance, the focus was on whether or not this was deemed to be sympathetic to the area. I think there's a difference between sympathetic and in keeping. In keeping maybe is perhaps looking at more of a pastiche, whereas this was considered to be sympathetic, and the views expressed by the conservation officer were that the dwelling would not cause harm to the conservation area and therefore preserved the character. So in that instance, we demonstrated that we had regard to section 72 and that the proposal would not cause harm to the character of the conservation area. Moving on then, protection of trees in conservation areas. Trees, obviously, if they are the subject of a tree preservation order, gain the maximum protection, but trees within a conservation area also benefit from a degree of protection. So under section 211 of the Town and Country Planning Act, it is an offence to cut down, top, lop or uproot a tree whose diameter does not exceed 75 millimetres. Sorry, it does not. It actually should read does exceed 75 millimetres. Similarly, if it's a tree within a group of trees or the removal would benefit other trees, then again, the measurement is 100 millimetres and that is taken 1.5 metres above ground level. There are some exemptions to or exceptions to those provisions in section 211. If someone wants to carry out work to a tree in the conservation area or fell the tree, they have to notify us of their intention at least 6 weeks before they intend to carry out that work. During that period, we will inspect the tree, we will determine what its health is, what the contribution that tree makes to the conservation area, and if we think the tree should be retained, we can then place a tree preservation order on the tree. Alternatively, we can give consent for the removal of that tree or the work that they are seeking to carry out. If a period of 6 weeks expires without us giving consent, then effectively that becomes a deemed approval to remove that tree, but that only lasts for up to 2 years from when the notice was served. Work is also authorised by the grant of planning permission. So again, if we grant planning permission for a dwelling that clearly results in the loss of trees, that would authorise the removal of the trees within the conservation area. Just to give you some examples of ones we've dealt with in the past, this is one in Watton. You can see that there's a row of trees. You can't see the full row, but there is a row of trees that run along this road. Part of the proposal included the removal of this large tree here, which I'm sure you will agree is very prominent in the area, makes a significant contribution. And that was one where we didn't give consent for removal, but we did place a tree preservation order on the tree. Another example here is in Hickling, not this tree, because this is clearly quite a prominent tree, but you can see here there's a smaller tree which was located within about 3 metres of the dwelling. And it was considered that due to the location of the tree, the health of the tree, and the limited contribution it made, that there was no objection to the removal of the tree. So in that instance, we did give permission within the 6-week notice period. Final example is here in Flintham. Here you can see there's actually a strong built form to the character of the area. You have a focal point tree at the end of the road, but there are some smaller trees situated behind the properties. And clearly one of the criteria for making of a tree preservation order are that firstly, the tree has to be in good health and stable. but most importantly, that tree has to make a contribution to the amenity of the area. And clearly, if a tree is situated behind buildings, not visible except perhaps through glimpses between buildings, then there wouldn't be a justification to make a tree preservation order in those instances. Just to touch then finally, there are other related permissions and issues. Clearly listed building consents, so if a building is listed, statutorily listed, there is a need to apply for listed building consent if you are altering that building or extending that building. There is also a requirement in a conservation area. If you are wanting to demolish buildings or structures, you require planning permission for what's called relevant demolition in a conservation area. And that relates to demolition of a building with a volume of 115 cubic metres or more, or where there is a proposal to demolish a wall or other means of enclosure, gate wall or other means of enclosure with a height of 1 metre or more when it's next to a highway, and more than 2 metres in any other case. Sarah did mention in her part of the presentation, we do have non-designated heritage assets. Clear examples of a non-designated heritage asset are key unlisted buildings within the conservation areas, and they equally make a contribution to the character and appearance of the area. So if, for instance, someone wanted to demolish one of those buildings, we would have to consider the impact of that and the contribution the building makes to the area. The final strand, if you like, of heritage assets is archaeology, which Sarah is far better versed in than I am, but obviously can relate to buried archaeology as much as above ground archaeology. And that is, again, something which we are required to protect. Thank you, Chairman, for time taken to give that presentation. If there are any questions or if you want to move into debate, I'll hand back to you now. When I can stop sharing.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for those presentations from both of you. Yeah, you mentioned toll roads. I think we're missing a marketing opportunity here. I think we should have lots of toll roads in Rushcliffe. We could make a lot of income out of that. Yeah, so I think archaeology, it's about when you're in the hole, keep on digging, isn't it, rather than stop digging. I think that's the definition. The recommendation that we have just recommends that the Scrutiny group note the content of the report. I intend that we do more than that because otherwise that's not very good scrutiny. So I hope that we can have an action at the end of this debate rather than just noting the report. I want to open it up to members of the committee, of the group, to contribute, but I would just like, I mean, I do have loads of questions, but the one particular one, I think, just to get things started, I would like Mr. Pegram to help us with, because he did talk about the substantial harm, etc. And it is very, and he did concede that it was a matter of judgment, but it's a question of how you actually address that judgment, because obviously it could well be that professional officers view things differently to people who are local on the ground and for whom they are directly impacted in some shape or form. So I'm not quite sure, Mr. Pegram, how you can actually help us, but I will pose the question to you in terms of how do we, whether you're members of a planning committee or whether in fact you are officers, what is the process in trying to address that substantial harm?
Yeah, it is a difficult one to answer, Chairman, as you allude to. It is a case, to a certain extent, your planning team comprises professional planning officers. We have Sarah provide advice, and it is, as I say, it is a matter of judgment. It's you know, if you take, for instance, the example I used of that modern house, I often describe contemporary architecture as Marmite. You either love it or hate it, and it's a matter of opinion largely as to whether something is sympathetic to the character of the area. if I was to take, for instance, an extension to a listed building as an example, an extension to a listed building need not be a pastiche of what's there. So it needn't be seeking to replicate the character and the appearance of the building. What it can do, it could be a contemporary extension, and it could be that the proportions of windows, the verticality of the original building is reflected in that extension. So it's a question of looking at those features to a certain extent and seeing if the building is sympathetic to what's there, not necessarily in keeping with, but sympathetic in terms of those features. And again, it might be that if you're putting a new dwelling in a conservation area somewhere, you look around at what's around you, and to be sympathetic, it should reflect some of those proportions, voids to solids type of considerations, and the proportion of windows and heights of buildings. So again, very much a matter of judgment, but considering all those types of factors.
Yes, sure, because you've mentioned the particular aspects of the development itself, but then there are other aspects that relate, if nothing else, to the impact possibly on the street scene within a conservation area, and how does that alter the character of that street scene. And I think perhaps that's probably where planning committee members have more of a problem in deciding on what the harm is to the conservation area in terms of the street scene.
Yeah, I think just if I may come back on that point. I mean, clearly, as you all know, Chairman, I often advise committee that all development has some impact. When you talk about development altering the street scene, again, that needn't necessarily, in the context of a conservation area, that alteration or impact in the street scene need not necessarily be harmful, providing it's done sympathetically. If there's no harm, then clearly that would, in terms of the requirements of the Act, preserve the character and appearance of that area.
Okay. Right. Well, I've got lots of other questions, but I'm anxious to bring other members of the scrutiny group in. So if you'd like to indicate with any questions, queries, comments, challenges, issues, whatever. I don't mind whether you put your electronic hand up or wave at the screen. I will do both. Councillor John Stockwood, I can see a hand waving.
I don't know why nobody else wants to go first. Okay.
Somebody has to.
Well, I don't really know where to start now. We'll come to scrutiny meeting about conservation areas, and I do recall we've talked a bit about planning enforcement in previous scrutiny. So I don't think we need to go over again how conservation areas are enforced, but in terms of conservation areas, I think the report presented as a process, or it has perhaps 3 steps, how I think of processes as an element of planning, implementation and review. So a process, and then there's a feedback loop from the review back into the plan. And that's my simple model of how I understand processes. So when we prepare or plan for a conservation area, you talked about an element of consultation. And I think what's key about conservation areas is they are driven by that community consultation. And it's that process where we capture what local people think is the parts that need to be preserved or enhanced within the townscape, and that townscape appraisal and the consultation shows that the whole process of conservation areas is driven by community saying what they think is harm, community saying what they think is substantial harm, and what are the negative aspects of the area. So one of the things I'm very keen on is that we have the statement of community involvement, which we adapted recently for pandemic measures. And one aspect of the principles of our public engagement is that we always need to do all that we can to reach hard to reach group or seldom heard groups. And so with any element or process that involves consultation, I would like to hear how that consultation can reach seldom heard groups, and whether or not we can expand upon the statement of community involvement to say that, you know, as conservation areas appraisals and a process are developed, that's also something that we embed all the principles of public engagement within the statement of community involvement in all our engagements with the public, ensuring that we're always seeking to reach as widely as possible within the community. That would be something I'd like to hear about, how we can do that when we prepare conservation areas. With regards to the implementation, you say we've got 30 areas, but I mean, I can see key developments within the borough that have no conservation area. So there's an issue there is, why do some areas choose not to have a conservation area? And my experience is sometimes, I think in one particular area, when I was chair of the old-fashioned development control committee, there was an area that felt that it didn't want a conservation area until it suddenly had a planning application, and when it felt that actually suddenly a conservation area would have been very helpful. So it's recording the reasons why communities are say no to conservation areas, and whether or not we have a clear process by which a community can say, we are keen on having a conservation area at this time. You've talked about harm and individual harm, and perhaps councillors have individual examples of harm. But one of the aspects that I'd like to hear about is how do we monitor harm to conservation areas, particularly that the cumulative effect of small harms can eventually build up to make a conservation area at risk. It's always welcome to hear that there are no conservation areas at risk because of the build-up of small harms within Rushcliffe. But it's about having a programme of condition surveys to make sure that we're keeping on board and keeping up to date on the monitoring of harm to the cumulative effect of many different applications in certain areas, rather than the management of each individual application on its own merits. One of the things I've heard councillors talk about at planning committee is they sometimes raise the impact on the community on the conservation area. So perhaps it would be helpful to talk about how ward councillors' comments on planning applications can be used as part of the feedback loop into whether or not a conservation area needs to be either reviewed or have a condition survey, to think about taking on board the points that are being made through ward councillors' comments at planning committees as seeing that as a positive feedback element when we consider about which conservation areas need review. Finally, Section 69, Section 72 that you've talked about say a particular phrase, which I think is preserve or enhance. So I think you've talked a little bit about non-designated heritage assets there, but I think a lot of the presentation you've given tonight is about how conservation areas are an element of we preserve and enhance through development management processes at the planning committee. We can do, perhaps as a council, do more than just have conservation areas. We could have a local list of non-designated heritage assets, and that is an additional step to improve the work that we can do to preserve heritage assets locally. And with regards to enhancement doesn't just necessarily mean considering a planning application as a reaction to a planning application being submitted. Enhancement could be a proactive step. For example, we have a proactive program of addressing empty homes because they have a negative impact, both socially and on the environment. So enhancement, or to preserve or enhance, as the law states, as statutory duty, could mean a program of actual addressing the negative impacts within conservation areas. And so what I was looking at when I looked at the report and having listened to the presentation is thinking about how within the preparation of plans we could ensure that our consultation reaches as many people as possible by embracing the principles of the Statement of Community Involvement and how that can across all our public engagements. How when we talk about implementing preservation and enhancement, we could think about a local list for non-designated assets and how we could be proactive in participating in local enhancement programs across whole areas or on individual properties. And then thinking a bit more about providing in some more detail about how in reviewing and ensuring that we keep those, I think the phrase is from time to time, we have a statutory duty to consider whether our conservation areas are up to date, that we have a program of condition surveys to monitor and ensure that the cumulative effect of small harms is not putting our conservation areas at risk, and and we listen to ward councillors' comments at planning and use them as a positive feedback mechanism to inform where we do reviews and condition surveys. So those are the points that I had around conservation areas, and I've suggested some outcomes that we could investigate as the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Begum, can you help us?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, a few bits there probably to provide responses to and clarification. I think, again, Sarah probably alluded to it in her part of the presentation, but the requirement for a conservation area and the sort of preservation of a conservation area is driven very much by the community. And in the at least the 2 or 3 cases that I'm aware of where we have made new conservation areas or reviewed old ones, it's been driven by the community. So the Cropwell Bishop one, for example, was very much a desire of the ward councillor and the community to have a conservation area for the village. Not necessarily widely welcomed by all, because as we've highlighted, it does impose certain restrictions on development in those areas. So not everyone may be too happy to be suddenly living in a conservation area. So Cropwell Bishop is a very good example, as I say, because the local history society there were very much involved in doing a lot of the assessment of the area, producing the documents that we then took over as part of the process to designate that area. And you asked a question about how we reach hard to reach groups when we designate conservation areas. Again, this is part of the reason why Cropwell Bishop hasn't been progressed, because what we would normally do is we would notify every single person living in that conservation area of the proposal to make a conservation area for the area. And that would normally then include an exhibition within the village. And again, it's that latter part which has, if you like, prevented us from progressing that, because clearly during COVID, we can't have an exhibition where people are gathering together. That would be in breach of the regulations. But again, that would be my understanding, and certainly from the discussions I had with our previous conservation officer and with Sarah, that's something that the History Society would be willing to assist with as part of that consultation and effectively final designation of the area. Councillor Stockwood is very right. We do have a duty to, from time to time, review the conservation areas and look at what the impacts have been on that area and whether they should perhaps be extended or reduced in size. We are in Rushcliffe actually quite fortunate because we have a conservation area management plan and appraisal for every single conservation area. Admittedly, they were done last done in 2009, But certainly there are examples, and I live in a village myself, where when I went to apply for planning permission for an extension, there was no conservation area appraisal. So I couldn't look at my proposal and see what the impact of my proposal was on the significance of that area, because it hadn't been identified anywhere. So we are fortunate, but nevertheless, I say not to be complacent. Yes, they could be reviewed. In terms of looking at the harm to the conservation areas, then reviewing them is part of monitoring what the harm of development has been. But equally, when we deal with each planning application, clearly we are mindful of what's been approved or built in the area previously, and we can take into account those cumulative impacts. The other point I'd probably make is that you can't preserve and enhance. It's either preserve or enhance, and that's obviously the wording from the legislation. The other point I should have made in the presentation is that the statutory duty to preserve or enhance only applies to development within the conservation area, not development that's outside but maybe adjacent. In those circumstances, we are still required to consider the impact on the setting of the conservation area, but that's through policy rather than the statutory duty. I think that probably answers all of Councillor Stockwood's points, unless there's anything I've missed or that Sarah wishes to add.
Councillor Stockwood, does that answer everything as far as you can recall?
Well, I'm sure the members of the group want to have their examples and want to talk about the different aspects of thing. But like I say, we can consider conservation areas as part of the planning process, and we're very responsible in doing that. And it's great that we have got the Townscape Appraisals. I think there was a generic appraisal that we used as a template to build them then. And I think I was involved in the consultation in Townscape Appraisal in 2009 for Bingham. And, so we welcome all of that. It's just, I was, in regards to the local list for non-designated heritage assets, or actively being proactive in enhancement programs beyond the management, beyond the planning process. These are steps to go beyond the planning process and see, as we talk about, that the built environment, the conservation area helps deliver wider, I think the text was wider social, cultural, economic and environmental objectives. Having an attractive town centre in Bingham contributes to an attractive town centre for retailers to bring in footfall. There is an element that it benefits the economic aspect of the sustainability triangle. There's also the social value of living in a well-maintained, attractive with individual local characteristics. And of course, the built environment and the natural environment form part of the environmental element of sustainability. So I do think that the conservation areas are not just a planning process matter, but also something we should look at when we think about, well, parishes to look at, and community-led plans. And we could develop a programme of thinking that sometimes there are key buildings within our Townscape appraisals which are negative, and not just the ones that pick up in the empty homes programme, but that we could be doing an enhancement programme and looking beyond managing development or controlling development and making sure that it preserves or enhance, but also going out and saying, being proactive, because that reacts to the applications that come in. We could be doing more to be proactive and going out and saying, can we speak quietly to a landowner or an area and say, well, why don't you come up with a scheme around improving that, and we can give you some advice. Perhaps that'd be our role as a borough council on what enhancing the conservation area would actually involve. So yes, I think we welcome all of the information about the planning process, and I think it's always a good idea to have up-to-date knowledge on the conservation area. I think the minister has recently made some changes to permitted development around turning buildings in from retail to residential that would be impacted by conservation areas, and so that has an impact on if you're trying to maintain a high street through your economic growth function. You won't be able to do that with these new powers because there's a conservation area in Bingham, and you won't have those. That will be blocked, that permitted development of turning retail into residential. So you need to think about it becomes the case that conservation areas are part of what we're doing there is preserving and enhancing the built and natural environment of an area because we think it has a special value, and that it can, that's something that we looked at as across the whole of an authority. And I think the Historic England document says regarding management and designation of conservation areas, does advise that you look at it as a whole authority in your businesses and processes when you're thinking about areas, that conservation is thought about in all that we do, because it has a role within the economic, social and environment sustainability of developments. But as I say, thank you very much for the answers given. I'll let other people in the committee speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Verdi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The question I have is centred around looking back at the purpose of this report in terms of the introduction which our executive manager gave in support of this particular item. I mean, firstly, thank you very much to our officers for a very comprehensive and thorough description and outline of the purpose of conservation areas and the application of policies. But I'd just like to go back to the root cause, I think, of the reason we had this report, which was paragraph 1.1 states that with the increased development taking place in the borough, concern has been expressed about the impact on conservation areas and how policy is applied. So my question, Mr. Chairman, is really very much around, do we have an indication of the magnitude or size of the issue here in terms of the impact caused by either challenges or refusals in terms of developments on conservation areas? And picking up on Councillor Stockwood's point around the cumulative effect of small impacts coming together and forming more of a holistic, bigger strategic impact. I'd be interested to hear from our officers, what is the magnitude of the problem, and to what degree, I suppose, is the process broken if it is? So I'm not challenging, as I said, some of the clarifications around the purposes of conservation areas and how we're applying the policy. I'm trying to understand the magnitude of the problem.
Yes, fair enough. Thank you. Mr. Pegram.
Thank you, Chairman. I think it's fair to say that the majority of our conservation areas relate to our villages. Outside of the main built-up areas. We use Ruddington as an example, which is probably one of the exceptions, because clearly Ruddington is one of our areas for growth, as is Keyworth, in fairness. But I think, I suppose the way I would explain this is that whilst the villages are not identified for growth, we do have policies that support development in those areas. But because of the scale of those areas and the size of those areas, they are potentially more sensitive change. So clearly, if you're putting a dozen houses into a conservation area village, that can have arguably a proportionately greater impact than something on the edge of one of our big towns. I think it's largely because there is we have seen a number of applications recently for development in the villages, introduction of additional housing, for instance. And I think that has sparked concern amongst residents and councillors as to what the purpose of the conservation area is when we're considering those applications. That's the best way I can answer it for you, Chairman, probably.
Thank you. It does actually prompt a thought in my mind, because in your presentation you did show the knoll at Colston Bassett. And if I remember correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that the impact of lighting emanating from the property was actually considered as part of the application because that actually was a classic example of, since approval was given and construction took place, the external, or not the external lighting, the lighting that emanates from within the building, because it's all glass, at night it sort of shines like a beacon, and it's the village is a typical English country sleepy village with very little light pollution, except where there's a large glass fronted house. And in fact, that does beg the question as well. Perhaps you could also help us with regard to external lighting as to how do we monitor. If, for instance, somebody wants to install external security lighting in some shape or form, whether it's floodlights or whatever, what are the restrictions there? Are they allowed to do whatever they wish, or do they have to apply for permission, etc.? So there's two elements to that. There's the light emanating from within, and then there's the external lighting, which from my experience of previous planning applications, that's not the only one where the problem has occurred. There are other instances as well. So I'll be interested to know, what are the restrictions, or what are the rules, what is the guidance, what are the particular factors that we can take into account?
Okay, so starting with external lighting, clearly in the case of the example we used and you've referred to, the knoll was subject to conditions that sought to control external lighting to the building or within the site. And there was a requirement to submit a scheme for the external lighting as part of the discharge of the conditions. That's clearly, we had the luxury there that was a new build and we could impose those conditions. But if we were to take an existing dwelling established in the conservation area, perhaps even pre-planning, the installation of a security floodlight on the outside of a building would not necessarily be development, and therefore would not fall within the control of the planning authority. So there is a difficulty to a certain extent if you're talking about installation of lighting on existing dwellings. There are other pieces of legislation which seek to control external lighting, but it's more to ensure that they don't cause a nuisance, so that someone doesn't put a floodlight on the side of their house that shines right into their neighbour. That obviously be dealt with not by planning, but by environmental health. The one about internal lighting is a very interesting question, really, because whether you can, external lighting is more likely to cause spillage and pollution, whereas the impact of internal lighting is that you will see it across a landscape. It's not necessarily creating a floodlight and a spillage of light, but it will have an impact from the visual aspects. And we did have one case where would have been interesting had committee refused it, because it was in the neighbourhood plan about external lighting, and there was a concern expressed on that application because it was potentially in conflict with one of the neighbourhood plan policies. That was approved, but clearly we haven't had that policy or that issue tested at appeal recently, unfortunately.
Right. So, sorry, what was the answer to the question then about the how do we address the impact of light, internal lights, which is in a glass-fronted house, the light emanating will be substantial. So how do we address that in terms of harm to the conservation area, which is the conservation area being used to a very sort of dark, sleepy village?
I think the answer probably, Chairman, is it's like any aspect of that development, you have to consider the impact of those elements on the character and appearance of the conservation area. One of the perhaps fortunate issues about the knoll is that it's very well screened by trees, and that was in fact, when you read the Conservation Officer's comments on that proposal, one of the factors taken into account was the level of screening that site benefited from. The other aspect, to a certain extent, is that Colston Bassett, I would suggest, has almost two elements to the conservation area. It has the historic core of the village, and then it has the development around the hall on Hall Drive. And that element of the conservation area is not, I would argue, quite as sensitive as the main centre of the village, which is obviously the more historic core, whereas Hall Drive is more modern properties built typically from about the 1960s onwards, and there have been some replacements there. That area has a very different character. So I think the answer to your question is yes, the character and the appearance of the dwelling and those impacts that arise from it are all factors which we can, and you as or the committee as decision makers can take into account when they are determining the impact on the conservation area and whether it causes harm.
Thank you. Right, any other contributions? Councillor Mrs. Stockwood and then Councillor Bailey.
Thank you, Chairman. Mention was made earlier of one conservation plan coming along soon. I just wondered what plans are in place to progress other areas which are hoping to have their conservation areas completed because start has been made on them or reassessed. I know of one village that's been is asking to be reassessed. I know conditions at the moment and over the last year or 15 months have been difficult, but I would like to know if we can move forward on those particular aspects. I have also a compliment in the villages I represent, the applications for tree works and you know, are very sympathetically treated and most welcome. So I did want to particularly mention that this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pegram.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, as Sarah highlighted, we have 30 conservation areas. Each one has a conservation area appraisal. Yes, it is a requirement of legislation that from time to time we review those conservation areas and the conservation area appraisals. Clearly, dare I say that does have resource implications. Wouldn't be done overnight because of the sheer number of conservation areas that we have got. In terms of the ones that are in the pipeline, if you like to call it that, I'm aware that East Leek is one where there has been a desire to see a review of the conservation area. We've got the Crophall Bishop one, which is fairly well advanced now, but has stalled effectively because of the COVID situation. You're testing my memory now. I think Knowlton was one where they were looking for an extension to the conservation area. I think that might be it, Chairman, unless my memory fails me at any point.
Right, okay.
If I could add to that, thank you, Chair. I have been contacted by a number of smaller communities that are interested in this, including Normanton-on-Soar. They would like a new conservation area. And I have also had conversations with a member of the community from Aslockton who is requesting updates on the review of the Aslockton Conservation Area review as well.
Sorry, Chairman, it was Aslockton, not Knowlton, I meant to mention.
Right. That just begs one question. How do you determine where somebody is asking for a new conservation area? How do you determine the boundary of it? Is it done purely on the visual aspect or the features, or is there some aspect of including land ownership? If you've got particular buildings, does then the land ownership surrounding that building, is that automatically also included?
I think that's one for Sarah, Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So when the boundaries of conservation areas are considered, we look to see what the special interest is of the particular local area. And that can include buildings, so the built heritage and environment. So those would be key unlisted or listed buildings. And we might consider their land surrounding them, whether that's because it has a positive open aspect that might contribute to a conservation area setting, And in some cases, such as Ruddington, we consider areas where tree-lined streets or hedgerows contribute positively to the setting of a conservation area. But from my experience, which is very limited to this point, and I'm guided by the other officers within the council, I largely understand this to first be opened up with a dialogue with the community so that they can bring to us the important aspects of their local settlements. And then we work with them and historical societies and the Nottinghamshire Heritage, the HER, rather short form for it, the Historic Environment Register. And we put together this information to identify the core of an area and then any important estates or settlements that need to be expanded. So for example, Bunny has Bunny Hall, and then there is the park to the rear, which is classed as an open space. I hope that gives you some insight.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Mrs. Stockwood, I think you were wanting to come back on something, yeah?
Yes, please. It's good to hear about the ones that have been mentioned and the correction re Aslockton, but there is another one, Scrutiny, that has gone through consultation and everything. This was 5 years ago. You know, we must get places that are requiring a conservation area up to date, if at all possible, please. Thank you.
Right, okay. Sorry, Mr. Pagan, did you have
No, I will check on that one for you, for members. Obviously, that's not one on my radar, but I will check on that one.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bailey, then Councillor Way.
Thank you, Chairman. I was wondering what weight would be given to the conservation area of a small rural village that might well find itself very close to a large garden village in the future, if a planning application were to be received by the Borough Council, because obviously it is a small rural village and they are really, really concerned, and it surely would impact hugely on that rural village. I'd be interested in your comments. Thank you.
Yeah, basically, so it's basically the impact of a large development on a close by small rural village.
So, Chairman, I take that to mean it's not within the conservation area, but outside and close to. I mentioned in those circumstances, there's not the statutory duty under the Act, but we still have to, under policy, have to have regard for the impact on the setting of that village. So clearly it would be looking at intervisibility, views into and out of the village as sort of examples of the types of things that we would have to consider. And clearly it would be down to, in terms of the level of harm, if there was any, it would be down to the proximity of that development to that conservation area and how it impacted on the significance of the conservation area in terms of its setting.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Way.
Thank you, Chair. I want to enhance on everything that Councillor Stockwood said at the beginning. I think he made a huge number of valid points. To start with, he was concerned about the little alterations that come that end up having a big impact. And currently in Eastleigh, we have 3 applications coming to planning that are causing a great deal of concern about the eventual impact on the area. Eastleigh's conservation area was reappraised by a local working party, a local history group, and went to consultation and was accepted by the parish council in the year 2015-16. It was sent to Rushcliffborough Council and has not been heard of since. Within our ward, Leek Ward, there are actually 2 villages who want to develop conservation areas. Ms Baker has already mentioned one, Normanton-on-Soar, but there's also Stamford-on-Soar. And what they've reported is they found it very difficult to find any information on how to go about this. So I want to know if there's any written advice, anything that they can follow to get started on this. They've got community willing to work on it. They know what their assets are, and they just want to get on with it. And they've asked how much support I can give, but I'm going to have to rely on the officers to tell me what we need to do. I think, sorry, I'm trying to read my notes, sorry. It's, there's a lot of concern about the way some of the things in, Councillor Stockwood mentioned the gratitude about the trees, but we're finding that there's decisions made about trees where we're given the results. And I think we'd appreciate a bit of consultation in advance when they're going to take down about a dozen trees in our conservation area for a new build. That's, I think, just for starters. Oh, I think Eastleigh, I understand Eastleigh conservation area was due for appraisal every 5 years, recommended by English Heritage. So it will be overdue for one now, even if the other one had gone through. So that's just for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Program.
Thank you, Chairman. I may hand back to Sarah on some of this. In terms of reviewing conservation areas, the legislation refers to from time to time. It doesn't specify a particular time, but Councillor Way is correct. I think it's in the English Heritage Guidance that 5 years is seen as a sort of a measure, if you like. English Heritage website, I think I'm right in saying, does include some guidance on conservation areas and how to go about making those conservation areas. Equally, Chairman, obviously not Sarah at the time, but our conservation officer at the time did provide a lot of support to the History Society and the residents in Cropwell Bishop when they were putting together their management plan and appraisal. So we have in the past provided a supportive role, but certainly in the ones that so far, as you've heard, have been progressed to a certain extent, we have been reliant on inputs and, if you like, work from volunteers to do sort of the initial appraisals and assessments themselves, as I say, with a degree of support. But I'm not sure if, Sarah, you can add any more to where there's any advice or guidance on making conservation areas.
Thank you. Historic England does have some guidance available on identification and the qualities that are necessary for establishing a conservation area. And I'd be very happy to send you some guidance on that. I did have a recent query about Stanford-on-Soar. Thank you for mentioning that. It popped into my mind immediately after I'd said Normanton-on-Soar as well. And the community has been in touch. In one case, I have been back to them and asked internally for clarification of some other information. And I do need to go back to both of the individuals that were in touch with me about this. So thank you for reminding me of this. I will go back to them and provide them this. And I would be happy to copy you into that if you would like to know of it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Wade, did you
Just
want
say
to
thank you, Sarah, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Great. Okay. Could I just ask, if I can, in your presentation, you mentioned several things. If I could just fire some quick questions. You talked about cladding in conservation areas. Does that include rendering as well? You talked about solar equipment, and I think this is one of the things that I'm afraid it sort of gets me going a bit when you drive through a lovely village with lots of pan-tiled roofed cottages, which have since been covered completely with solar panels. So what's the point of having a conservation village with lovely pan-tiled roofs if you then cover them with a glossy glazed solar panel? And heritage assets, is that purely based on buildings or bricks and mortar, or does it include the street scene as well? So that's just a couple of or three quick questions.
I think the first one was about the rendering. Yes, that does require permission in a conservation area. That's a form of cladding, basically. In terms of solar panels, Chairman, this was interesting because obviously I haven't dabbled in permitted development for many years as a planner. The GPDO is quite often changing, but it was interesting when I went through for this presentation that solar panels on the front of a roof of a property in a conservation area are not precluded. There's two in the GPDO. There's two categories that relate to alterations to the roof. There's Class B, which deals with extensions and enlargement of the roof, so things like hip to gable, dormer windows. Class C deals with other alterations to roofs, so things like installing Velux roof windows and solar panels. And again, the requirement there is that the addition does not project more than 150 millimetres above the plane of the roof. So obviously, if a solar panel fits within that criteria, unfortunately, it is permitted development. But I was surprised by that, and I'm not sure why they chose to preclude it on commercial buildings, but not residential, because in most of the villages, you'll have a predominance of residential rather than commercial buildings. But as I say, we can only work to the legislation we have. In terms of heritage assets is a collective term for everything that has a historical or heritage value. So a conservation of, obviously, typical listed building is a feature, it's a physical feature which is deemed a heritage asset. A conservation area is also a heritage asset. And as Sarah mentioned, there are lots of components that feed into the character and appearance of that heritage asset.
Yeah, I'm afraid you haven't given me much comfort, I'm afraid, regarding the solar panels, because to me, that is immense harm to a conservation area.
Don't disagree with you, Chairman.
Yeah. Which, and you touched on it, Velux roofs, maybe, or Velux windows rather. Am I correct? I've always understood that you're not allowed to have Velux windows fronting onto the street in a conservation area. Am I correct, or am I wrong?
No, that's again a type of development that's not precluded in a conservation area, providing it complies with the other criteria. So again, the 150 millimetre proud of the roof type of thing.
Right. Okay. Does anybody else have any contributions? I'd like to sort of try and formulate some recommendations to come as a result of this discussion, because obviously, as I say, I think if we just say that we're noting a report, then we failed. But I quite see that we probably will want to bring something back for further consideration, but I'll ask Leanne if she wants to comment on that in a minute. But I'm just wondering if, and I'm quite happy for people to come back and correct me, but as far as I can see, that perhaps a recommendation to review conservation area appraisals may well be in order, and also for us to look at enhancement programme. Councillor Stockwood talks about being proactive in encouraging property owners to look at their assets, and perhaps there should be a way of assessing how we can encourage. I hesitate to use the word force, because I think it's very difficult to within legislation to force somebody, but that's why I'm trying to use the word encouragement, to encourage property owners where they've fallen into sad disrepair to be brought in to enhance the conservation area again. And then I think this is a very important one, the cumulative effect of small harms becoming a large harm. And the difficulty with that is, it's almost like when we talk about precedent in planning applications in the committee, and you, I mean, a classic one is where you have a side extension on a, oh, well, that one's okay. next door one and the one next door to that, etc. And before you know it, you've completely changed the street scene. But if you look at any one of those applications, I'm sure that whether it's Mr. Pegram or any other planning officer would be saying, well, you know, the harm is significant, but then if all 20 houses do it, then you know, that's a significant harm. And I think that that's possibly a similar situation where there are these harms in relation to, I think perhaps we should look at how we can assess the cumulative effect. And I have to say it's the potential cumulative effect, isn't it? Because with one particular application, people will say that's okay, but then how do you judge whether there will be a cumulative effect in the future? So I just wonder if there's a way in which we can recommend that those be looked at. And the other one that I wanted to ask about, so I'm conscious that time is getting on, but we haven't really talked about resources and resources in the conservation function, but then also perhaps in relation to enforcement as well. And perhaps, I don't know whether Mr. Pegram or Sarah can give me any, well, I was going to say comfort, that's not the right word, but any clue as to the resources available and how we believe that we are actually performing the function. Are the resources sufficient? And again, then the resources in terms of actually enforcing where necessary within the conservation area.
Chairman, if I start with enforcement, because clearly enforcement has already been subject of a scrutiny item, and we had a review of capacity and resources within the team. The outcome of that was an indication that the people doing the review felt that our resources were adequate for the amount of activity within the borough. In terms of the conservation area work, clearly we do only have one conservation officer. Let's say some authorities, I have done a bit of work on this already, and some authorities don't have any conservation officers. They rely on contractors to come in and do work as and when necessary. Sarah is one conservation officer in a team of planners. Arguably, it's not only Sarah's responsibility to consider the impact on conservation areas when we are dealing with planning applications. That's a responsibility for all the planning officers as well. Sarah is there to provide specialist advice to those officers. So, for instance, if an officer is dealing with a rear extension to a property which is not visible from the public realm, I would expect a planning officer to be able to assess the impact on the conservation area without necessarily input from Sarah. Clearly, if it's a bigger development or a new house or anything of that nature, then Sarah is there to provide the advice on those applications.
And I suppose, how do we assess? It might be a bit of an unfair question on Sarah, but I'll ask it anyway. Maybe you have a very good answer. In providing that information and advice to a planning committee, how do you, because every application is different. I'm surprised Mr. Pegram's never told us that. But how do you ensure consistency in your advice when every planning application is different? So I would just be interested to know, how do you get that consistency in your advice?
It can be difficult because of the volume of development that happens in Rushcliffe, but I do my very best to give the same attention and scrutiny to all of the proposals that are put before me. Since I began, I have benefited from some mentoring that was brought in-house to Rushcliffe from a former conservation officer. And during that time, we developed a systematic approach to applications so that during my examination, I follow almost a formulaic set of criteria. I make heavy use of conservation area guidance, but as the conservation officer, it can be up to my determination in some parts to decide whether there is an unidentified positive contribution by some features since a conservation area has been designated. So that does rely again on judgment, similarly to harm in terms of it, whether it's no harm, less than substantial, which incorporates most proposals if there is any harm, and then substantial harm. But I follow a lot of national guidance. I follow our local plan policies. I make use of quite a lot of guidance from Historic England and the Institute for Historic Building Conservation, which, aside from its name, does largely provide advice on conservation areas and non-designated heritage assets as well. So I do my best to consider all of these things whilst determining my comments on planning applications. I also consult the Nottinghamshire Historic and the HER records, sorry. And I look at a lot of our historic maps so that I can see development over time in order to assess what sort of features are important and how any development proposals would impact these. I hope that gives some idea. And Andrew, I can see you have some comments.
Chairman, just to add to that, clearly Sarah's role is to assess the applications and advise the officers if there is any harm. There is a step beyond that, which again is to a certain extent down to judgment, but it's the officers and where the planning committee are involved as decision makers to then apply the planning balance as to if harm is identified, whether there are any public benefits arising from the development and whether those public benefits outweigh the harm. So it's almost a two-stage approach. Clearly, I'm sure that the planning officers are more than delighted when Sarah says there's no harm because they don't need to go to that next stage. But there is that second stage, which is down to the officers and when committee are considering something, the planning committee as decision makers.
And that remind me as well, because harm can also include use of open spaces to developing on previously open spaces within a conservation area, and also there have been instances where within a conservation area the garden space guidelines have not quite been reached. So how is that approach made where you are satisfied with the fact that it doesn't harm the conservation area, given the fact that it hasn't actually reached the minimum garden standards?
That can be a matter, Chairman, of assessing the development in terms of the pattern of development in the area. So, I mean, there are some examples where if you're putting a new dwelling into a village, it might be that the existing garden spaces don't actually meet the standard. So it is a matter of, again, applying that judgment and looking at whether or not whether the proposal that's before you conflicts with the character and pattern of development in that area.
Okay, thank you. Right, well, as I say, I'm conscious of time. Does anybody have any other points they want to raise? Sorry, Leanne, I haven't really given you an opportunity to come back or to comment. Is there anything you'd like to comment on? I'm thinking particularly about possible recommendations I made, or I'm suggesting we put to the group relating to reviewing the conservation area appraisals, an enhancement programme relating to properties in need of repair, and then the cumulative effect of small levels of harm. Is there anything, having heard the debate, anything you would like to comment on?
Thank you, Chair, for bringing me in. No, I think our intention today was to really do exactly what we've done. So inform the group, inform members of what we're doing, the guidelines we follow, the processes that we undertake, and bringing forward that sort of discussion about judgment and how actually we're relying on experienced and qualified officers to bring that judgment in, but in balance with the legislation and the guidelines and the policies. So I think we've had a good debate on that, and hopefully that's been beneficial to everybody to hear how we undertake it. So we always thought that we would be bringing something back to a future meeting, focusing in on a particular area of interest. So I think on that, I would just say, yes, happy to bring something back to a future meeting. Let's make it, if it's just something for information, like in terms of conservation area appraisals and the ones that are outstanding, and that's something we can do that outside of the meeting. If we want to scrutinise something in terms of getting into the detail and the nitty-gritty of something and how you can influence change, then I think that would be a good use of the group's time. So just in terms of focusing that down, let's make it, we've spent a good while discussing this tonight. Usually we would just have an hour per item because we sort of have a 2-item agenda. So keeping it narrow and focused would be my recommendation, and something where if you feel as though there's something you want to enhance or improve the way something is carried out, then let's focus on that. But I think also there's a really important point that I've heard tonight is about empowering the local communities more. So we've only got finite resource, as we've said. We've got Sarah and we've got the other planning officers who help and support Sarah. But really, it's also empowering communities, and there's a role there for ward councillors and parish councils as well in driving some of this forward. So that's sort of all I'd say really about getting that balance right.
Yeah, but how are we going to translate that into a recommendation?
So I think it would be useful to understand, you've sort of given three areas that you're interested in. If you could narrow that down to specifically what it is you'd like to look at in those areas. So normally the way we do that is you agree sort of a topic now, and then afterwards you complete a matrix with a bit more detail so that we're making sure that we're really bringing back what you want to hear, not what we think you want to hear. So, and in the same way that this matrix was completed prior to this meeting, and we've gone through that and answered all the points raised. So if you agree a topic now in your recommendation, we can work with you following this meeting to flesh out exactly the specific points that you want to cover, so that we're targeting it for the follow-up meeting.
Yeah, well, it doesn't have to be limited to one topic, because we are sort of scrutinising conservation areas.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about timing and trying to do justice. So if there are complementary areas that we can get covered in an hour, then that, of course.
Yeah, I think from my my own feeling is that, for instance, things like planning committee applications, I think the area where we probably get most exercised is the harm to the conservation area. So I think perhaps, as well as a cumulative effect of small harms, maybe we ought to look more closely as to how we assess, how members can assess the harm, and maybe that might involve some form of training or I won't say it's training as such, but an informative, shall we say, as to how to assess harm. And I think that might be useful for especially planning committee members, but obviously not limited to planning committee members, because anybody could be substituting on a planning committee at any time. So open to all members, but certainly planning committee members. And I think that would be a very useful asset for almost bring it under the title of induction training, if you like. Informative. Mr. Pegram, you look as though you wish to comment.
Oh, Chairman, I'm thinking on that point, and I'm just obviously looking, we're not in the same room together, obviously, but looking to Leanne for sort of confirmation. I think that's more of a, as you've highlighted, more of a training session than a scrutiny item. I think it's highlighted through this debate this evening and the report that that's an area of concern, particularly where members find themselves in the difficult position of sitting on committee having to judge one of these schemes. But I think, I don't know if you agree, Leanne, that's more for a training item than I'm not sure how much you can scrutinise judgment.
Well, hang on. What I meant was that we have a recommendation that an informative on harm take place. So that's exactly what I was suggesting. I wasn't suggesting necessarily that we scrutinise it, although let's wait and see. Maybe if we have a training session, strokes informative session, that might well create a scrutiny of harm. Who knows?
Yeah, I think I can, we can support that as a recommendation. We're just reviewing our member training at the moment anyway, so we can certainly include something on that topic.
Yeah. So I think that we ought to look at an enhancement programme of properties in disrepair, and we have that training session on harm, and we recommend that we have that we review conservation area appraisals, because I think that will then inform planning committee in the future. Assuming. I mean, does that make sense to members of the group? Are there any other points or recommendations that anybody wishes to propose, or are you happy to go with those? Any particular comments there, Councillor John Stockwell?
Two things I would particularly be interested in is the council develops a local list of non-designated heritage assets in an above, which is more than just having a conservation area. It is something that other councils do, and it enables us to do more than protect designated assets, but also look at non-designated assets. In regards to the enhancement programme, enhancements can mean a number of different things. I think there's some guidelines in the Historic England management and appraisal document about towards the back of the document when he talks about managing areas. There can be also elements of enhancement, landscaping schemes, putting on events that reflect the traditional character of the use. We talk about sometimes the conservation area is about the use of a building. You can put on it, as the example given in I was reading Historic England's document. It's paragraph 100 and 101, and an example you can put on the give of traditional fair markets in an area which is has a historic use as markets and this sort of thing. So there's a number of different elements of what an enhancement programme to mean. So I'd support the agenda, the item about looking at a proactive programme of what we can do in enhancements and working with local communities and specific landowners. And I like to go back and try and push again for the idea of developing a local list of non-designated heritage assets. Thank you.
Yeah, well, yes, I certainly agree with that, because actually within, and I know it doesn't happen in every area, but where there are neighbourhood plans, there are some neighbourhood plans that include lists of non-designated heritage assets, but it's not obligatory. You don't have to. But yes, I think that that would be something to take on board, because if nothing else, that does help inform future decisions within conservation areas. Mr. Pegram looked like it, yes.
Chairman, yeah, if I may add, I mean, it's been mentioned several times this evening about working with communities. And again, we have lots of parish councils, and some of this work, I would suggest, can be undertaken by parish councils. So if we're talking about planting schemes and that type of thing, it's not solely dependent. I mean, obviously, I'm speaking outside of a planning role now. You know, there are enhancements that can be undertaken either by the parish council or the community with guidance. But also, if you've mentioned about empty buildings, clearly, if members wanted to draw to our attention particular buildings that cause them concern, we can look at those from not just a planning point of view, but other powers that we have as well.
Yep, fine. Yeah, so I think I'd like to include that non-heritage asset list in with our recommendations, so that we can look at those in the future. Right. Oh, sorry, Councillor Way.
Thank you, Chair. Just one thing that might be part of the training or the development of the members is what changes do you think there'll be to the relevance of conservation areas when the government brings in all their new planning regulations?
I don't have I don't have a crystal ball, but
come on.
my understanding to a certain extent is that there will be potentially 3 designations for growth. One of those areas would be protected areas, and I think conservation areas would fall within those protected areas from my recollection. So that's as much as I can tell you. Clearly, we don't know the outcome of the white paper consultation yet, and how and when those changes to planning legislation may come in.
Watch this space, I think, is the answer.
I thought that would be the answer, really.
Right. Okay. I'm conscious that it is now 9 o'clock, so we should draw this to a close. Is everybody accepting of the recommendations that we formulated? Obviously, we have the first recommendation that we note the report, but then have these sort of actions ongoing, which will then come back to a future scrutiny group meeting. Is everybody in agreement, or which the easiest way is, could I ask, is there anybody who doesn't agree with those actions that we've now talked about? So if I can take it then that everybody is in agreement that we take those forward, and it'll come back to a future meeting. It doesn't preclude, of course, if we ask if anybody has any other ideas want to bring back to a future meeting, then we can do so. Right, so I'll take that everybody is in agreement with that. Right, thank you. Okay, right, well, in which case, as I say, time is getting on, so let's draw this to a close. Oh, sorry, I've just realised we've got the work programme, haven't we?
Yeah.
So, but can I just first of all thank Andrew and Sarah for your presentation. That's very kind of you. Thank you very much. And it certainly was very comprehensive, that's for sure. So we have the work programme. I've just lost the page just for a minute. Folded it over. I don't know, Leanne, do you want to talk to this? Because I think we've got the cycling networks coming up next, I think, haven't we, and the footbridge.
Yes, that's right. So the cycling networks in the borough, as deferred from this meeting, is on the agenda for July, along with the Trent footbridge. October, the scrutiny item is COVID-19 business recovery update. And then moving into January next year, we've got tree conservation. So there's space in your work programme there for additional items. So the July meeting, we have 2 items, so that's a full agenda, and the following 2 meetings, October and January, just a single item on those. So if you had any other items that you wanted to bring, obviously we've got the conservation.
Well, I was just going to say,
to bring back.
It would be ideal at the moment to, I don't know if timescale realistic. Perhaps I'm being very presumptive here, but I wouldn't have thought there's a lot of work involved. Could we provisionally put that onto the October work programme?
Yep, yes we can. And then January, so there's space in January.
One is it? Yeah, I mean it can be subject to change, but at least let's put that on provisionally.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so conservation will be in October, and then if you've got any other work, any other items, then we've got space in January.
Yeah, lovely. Great. Okie dokie. Right, we'll call it a day there. I'll call it a night, one or the other. So thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all the officers for staying on up until now. And thank you to members of the scrutiny group. And with that, I will declare the meeting closed. Thank you very much indeed. And a very good night and a safe journey home, everybody.
Good night.